Hello and welcome to the Underhive. We are back with some more How to Command the Death Guard. In this series, we're going to take a look at every aspect of the Death Guard, so whether you're looking to get more out of your army, or you're thinking of joining Nurgle's finest, then there's something here for you. In this episode, I wanted to take a look at the winning list from Alexandre Sacco, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, with a first place win at the London GT, a 720 player GT with 10 games, going 10-0 with the Emperor's Children. Now, I'm not going to run through everything about that list. The point here of the video is to look at the strengths of that list and to look at what we as Death Guard players can do to try and compete with that. Now, as it goes, I think Emperor's Children are the strongest Chaos Space Marine faction. I've come up against them several times in Nephilim, though not a competitive, 720-man tournament like the London GT. So whilst on one hand, the games that I've done well in, perhaps they weren't as strong a player as the likes of Alexandre Sacco, but otherwise, ultimately, they still felt tough games for the Death Guard, and that's not necessarily true against some of the other traitor legions. Now, first things first, I just want to point out that whilst I do think they are the strongest, that does not take anything away from the monumental victory 10-0, not only going undefeated in a 720 person tournament, but you've got to bear in mind the bracketing as you go through the games should be pairing up with, when he was at 5-0, coming up against another player that was at 5-0, ideally, if that was possible. And so you've got to consider that not only did Alexandra win all of those games, he won those games, particularly in the latter stages, against armies and players that were there themselves to win. And actually going up against Tau, I believe, with more than a 10-point lead in that last game in the final against the Tau list, which arguably Tau, obviously a very strong faction at the moment, but they do have the sorts of answers that Emperor's Children really don't want an army to have in terms of that shooting output, because, of course, the Emperor's Children, significant buffs when they are in and around melee engagements. So just to go through that as an overview rather than the full list, why do I feel they are so strong and what can we as Death Guard players do about that? Firstly, they have a ton of fight first. All of the units that can take a mark must take a mark of Slaanesh, which means they're going to be fighting first. Now, Death Guard do have ways to turn that off. We will come back to that. But if it wasn't for that, the match would feel near on insurmountable. They have tons of melee and shooting that is going to be getting essentially a constant +1 to hit because they ignore any and all modifiers they wish to when it comes to shooting and fighting as Emperor's Children. So that's invalidating Dense, it's invalidating Miasma of Pestilence, but it's also meaning that they can ignore the -1 to hit on those juicy Power Fists and Chain Fists on the Terminator brick that I'm sure you will have seen no matter what Chaos Space Marine Legion you may have come up against. They have options for Fight Last, so if they did take Lucius, that wasn't in the selection here from Alexandra. Again, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I apologise if I'm not. But yeah, it wasn't in the list there, Lucius, so not going to be having that automatic Fight Last whenever he's in range, but they have got the stratagem for a character to use Fight Last. The Disco Lord on the Hellstalker did have the trait there to allow them one stratagem of that type for free in the game. So even if there was a point where the Emperor's Children were on 0 CP, they could still pull that Fight Last out of the bag if it was needed, I believe. And not only that, but they've got a stratagem for Advance and Charge. So it's not army-wide, it's only going to be one unit, but there are some fantastic units in the list there, particularly the Chaos Terminators. You would love to see them advancing and charging as the Emperor's Children player. Now, they also have that supremely durable Terminator brick. One thing to note is that although I don't think the Mark of Slaanesh is bad by any means, the Mark of Tzeentch is the more common pick when I've played against non-Emperor's Children Chaos Space Marines. The Mark of Tzeentch allows you to reduce the damage to 0 for your first failed save each turn. That can be got around by shooting in some, relatively low impact fire and hoping they roll a 1 and, fail an armor save. Get rid of that, and then you can pump in your more high output damage. But ultimately, that's not a consideration here for the Emperor's Children. They're going to have that Mark of Tzeentch, which means they fight first. Which, to be fair, for Death Guard is more worrying than just ignoring one of the damages that gets through. So just to give you an overview on that, if you're not familiar, we've got 10-man Terminator Brick, tons of Power Fists, got as many Chain Fists as possible. We've got 2 Melters in the squad there as well. So all that put together, bear in mind, normally those fists would be hitting on 4s. They're going to be hitting on 3s. They can advance and shoot the Melter part and then advance and charge even because of the stratagem. So that's not going to be at a penalty either. They could shoot both parts of the combi Melter there with no penalty to either part, whilst the extra shots on the bolter part of that probably aren't that high impact against Death Guard. It's still nice to have against a mixed field, as you would have in a tournament. But in terms of their defensive profile, they had the Dark Apostle in there, the evil chaplain, giving the trans hit, so you can't be hit on a hit roll of a 3 or less, and that hit roll cannot be re-rolled, meaning you're just taking half of those dice straight out of the pool, and there's nothing the opponent can do about that most of the time. Obviously, a very lucky hit roll from the opponent could put the kibosh on that, but you can only really play to the averages. On top of that, the Black Rune, it is going to make Psychic more difficult. You'll perils on a double of any kind if you're nearby them, but otherwise it's giving them -1 to wound. Of course, the wound roll is where the Death Guard excel with their contagion ability and plague weapons, particularly if it's backed up by Arch Contaminator. That doesn't limit that too heavily, but -1 to wound is certainly going to save some damage going through across the course of a game, but certainly across the course of 10 games. They've got that 2-up save with Armour of Contempt and the 5-up invuln, and because the Master of Possession is going to have Mark of Slaanesh, he's going to have access to the Slaanesh specific spell, which gives a unit a 5-up Feel No Pain. So there are just no angles really that you're going to get on these Terminators to quickly and easily deal with them. They've got that great armor save if you go in for weight of dice. They've got that 5-up invuln and realistically a 4-up save against the majority of weaponry out there being AP3 or less. It's only going to be big, heavy weaponry like melters, multi-melters, some Xeno weaponry that, again, can hit AP4, 5, and the likes of Tau with those railguns with that big AP ignoring invulns. But again, that isn't going to take out masses of the Terminators at once. They're supported by that Master of Possession. He's going to have Pact of Flesh. That's going to heal one if it was damaged and bring one back to life. So really dealing with them over time is not an option because you're just giving your opponent a target to use Pact of Flesh on. They can get out early with that advance and charge, and they just don't really care about incidental losses. It would only be big losses, 5, 6, 7 models, potentially forcing the opponent to spend to make sure they don't have to roll and potentially fail morale. Ultimately, Death Guard have the option to make that -4 leadership count there, but again, I think as the Emperor's Children player, there's one unit you cannot afford to lose. It is that Terminator Brick. If it is in risk of failing morale and losing models, you're probably spending the CP there to make it auto-pass most of the time. So how, as Death Guard, can we deal with that? Realistically, the Noise Marines with that Blastmaster, there is nothing you can do about it. It's 4 damage flat. If it hits your Terminators and you don't get that 4-up invuln save, it is what it is. They're dead. Now, having a Plague Surgeon in there, I have played against Emperor's Children with a Plague Surgeon in there, and when that 6-up Feel No Pain comes off and leaves a guy alive on 1, that can be very nice because the second shot, if it does make it through, is just finishing them off. But I don't really run the Plague Surgeon myself. I wouldn't recommend including it on the off chance you're shot by Blastmasters, because otherwise it doesn't really feel like the Plague Surgeon does as much as some of the other options you could take. But it is reasonable to have one if you're kitting yourself out to be protected a bit better against those Blastmasters. Otherwise, really, you're looking at trying to be obscured as much as you can whilst maintaining control of as many objectives as you can. The -1 damage is going to have some game against those fists. Of course, the power fist going from 2 to 1 is a nice reduction for us, and the chain fists going from D3 to D3 -1, most of the time just dealing the 1 damage, is again fine. Either way around, they're putting your Terminators on their invuln, so that is what it is. Ideally, you don't want to get your Plague Marines tangled up with those Terminators because they do outbash them, even despite that -1 damage. In terms of Warlord traits and relics, I think Arch Contaminator is a must. Yes, no rerolls to wound has become more common. You've got the Iron Warriors, you've got Salamanders, and you've got Votann now. I believe there are a couple of other chapters for a couple of other factions that I don't know as well. I think maybe one of the sisters might have it, but I could be wrong on that. But outside of those particular matchups, Arch Contaminator is just such a massive incremental force multiplier. You really do need it in the list in a variety of games. And against the Emperor's Children there, having an Arch Contaminator to support your Blight Lords or support your Death Shroud in that engagement with the Chaos Terminators is an absolute must to convert as many of those hits that can get past that trans hit, 4-up, no rerolls, to hit them, to try and convert as many of those as possible past the -1 to wound into saves that the Terminators need to make. Glomine Blow is one of those where Emperor's Children aren't massively reliant on the rerolls. Even with Abaddon in the list, they're not getting the same level of rerolls as Black Legion would. But particularly with Abaddon in the list, it is going to be nice to have that Glomine Blow in the central engagement, just to limit the efficacy of Abaddon's supporting buffs. But even without Abaddon in the list, being unable to just command point reroll that wound that you think you need to really make sure you kill a unit or kill a model or kill a unit is a nice addition there. So I think if you are going competitive at the moment, a Glomine Blow is certainly a strong consideration. Plague Skull of Glorfilla is an absolute must. Whether you're up against a unit like Abaddon that has the phase limited damage, so you can only take 3 damage per phase. Of course, Plague Skull goes off at the end of the movement phase, so it is damage out of phase in a way that you just don't see from many other armies, though fortunately for the Emperor's Children, they have a similar relic that is multi-use. It's not quite as high a max damage output as the Plague Skull, but it is usable every turn. Now, I don't think that was in this list, but I do like that as a relic just because of how strong Plague Skull is. But either way, not necessarily needed by the Emperor's Children. Having that Plague Skull in the list does threaten. Come on then, Abaddon, if you want to come in and see who's hard enough, I'm going to be able to throw the Plague Skull at you, hopefully get the max 3 that I can deal. A smite or 2 could then follow up in the psychic phase, and then we've got shooting and fighting to try and chip off the last bit. But all that being available is still easier said than done. He has a great defensive profile. He's got all the marks. He's going to be ignoring that first damage per turn, either in the shooting or the fight phase. Hopefully you're lucky enough to get some shooting through, and then your fighting at least can go straight to the bone. But again, without that Plague Skull in there, it's going to be a much tougher challenge. If you're not up against somebody like Abaddon, I have taken out the likes of Lucius with it. That means his when his death ability doesn't proc. So if he's killed as a result of an attack, that would allow him to deal mortal wounds in response to illustrate that if the killer takes pride in killing Lucius, they would become Lucius the Eternal. And that mortal wound output is to sort of consider that they will die off the back of that. The Plague Skull doesn't trigger that because it's not an attack, it's just an ability from a relic. So even if you're not up against Abaddon, having that in there to get rid of a character as soon as they come in range, very, very important. If you don't feel that the opponent's characters pose that reasonable threat, it's also great into those Terminators, but again, sadly, they're probably going to have that 5-up Feel No Pain from the Slaanesh specific spell, so it's not a guarantee of any models killed whatsoever. Death Shroud are super important, I think, at the moment. Not only do they have that high damage profile to really limit the saves available to those Terminators, but at that point they're going to be wounded on 3s because of the -1. If you've got the Arch Contaminator, you can re-roll the 1s and 2s there, hopefully push the majority of those heavy attacks that got through the hit roll onto the saving throw. And again, given you can't hit on anything better than 4s, you might as well take the -1 to hit, because that would put you to 3s anyway. So going with a heavier profile, not a terrible option. You have got the lighter profile for the weight of dice option. Not great into the Terminators with the Black Rune, because you're not getting to hit on 2s, and you're not getting to reroll 1s or full rerolls if you did have Mortarion in the list. So again, I think you go with a heavier profile more often than not, but it is great when they're supported by Arch Contaminator, because at least you are able to do your wound rerolls. The Putrefier, now, I specifically started running a Putrefier because I was coming up against a lot of Chaos Space Marines with this Terminator brick, whether it was Emperor's Children or otherwise, and he does make the difference. That additional mortal wound output on 6s on the likes of the Death Shroud can be very potent. It is a toss-up, really, whether you go, if we're talking about a full squad of 5, whether you go with 21 attacks on the heavy profile hitting on 4s, or you go with 42 attacks hitting on the lighter profile, again though only hitting on 4s. You have then got the greater chance of having more dice to look to push those 6s if you go for the lighter profile. But because you're losing so much on that hit of a 4, it feels wrong to me to go for the lighter profile. So whilst I would, if we were talking about what they call Deathwing Knights, or even just Dark Angels Terminators that are in a circle and have that transhuman, I probably would go for the lighter profile there. Either way around, Armor of Contempt is making the 1 AP irrelevant, so they're saving on 2s, but you can really get the weight of dice through the hit roll against the likes of Dark Angels, where you're going to struggle to do that against the Terminators unless you're very lucky. So for me, I think you go with the heavier profile, take the damage you can, only re-roll your misses on the wound roll, and just push the 6s that you can. The Blightspawn is also a pivotal inclusion here. So important in this matchup. Of course, with the included relic there as well, the Revolting Stench Vats gives him a 6-inch aura where you can prevent fight first, and your opponent doesn't count as charging. Now, of course, they're going to have that fight last effect, so they could still make you fight last and hit you before you get to hit them. But if they've not got that in range, maybe the character isn't actually in the engagement, didn't make the charge, if you can position well enough that they have to enter that 6-inch aura range to be able to be in engagement of your Death Shroud or whatever it might be, that can make all the difference by allowing you to attack them first before they get to smash you in the face. Any models at all that you can remove is removing attacks. That is attacks that just aren't gonna kill you. So having the Blightspawn in there, I think, not only super important for the Emperor's Children matchup, but it's just such an important model on the field when we're talking about any melee engagement where the opponent doesn't have the speed to just avoid the central objective and go around and target your flanks if they are an easier option for them. And then in terms of stratagems, there's really only one that you need to have in your mind the whole time. Interrupt. You have to have that 2 CP available. Now, I spend 5 before the game, which means even if I go first, I'll have 2 available on my first turn. I should still be able to spend 1, maybe even both, and have enough to be able to interrupt on turn 2 when it's more likely to be important. But sadly, against the Emperor's Children, because they've got that advance and charge option, you really need that 2 CP available turn 1, just in case they can get multiple charges off. But chances are turn 1, if they do make that advance and charge, it's probably only going to be that 1 engagement, and the interrupt is largely irrelevant there. But at any point where there is more than 1 fight going on, Of course, if they're outside of your Blightspawn's range, they are all going to be fighting first, whether they charged or they didn't. So having that 2 CP to interrupt is crucial. The Noise Marines, if they decide to come up close, which these guys were built for, Power Fist and Chainsword on the Champ, Chainswords on the other 3, and then the Blastmaster, of course, for that supreme heavy firepower. Ultimately, once they do get in range of the Plague Marines, the Plague Marines can do a great number on them as long as we can attack them before they severely limit the number of the Plague Marines in that squad. So having that interrupt available to try and take out a unit before it can fight first is pivotal. And when you line that up nicely with the Blightspawn and they've not been able to fight last year, that can mean that you go, well, I don't need to interrupt here with my Death Shroud in and around the Blightspawn because your guys aren't counting as charging. So you're going to hand the initiative to me first there. On the other engagement, you will fight first, either because you charged or just because you Slanesh. And so they are going to attack there, fine. But we've got another one out on this wing that I'm going to then be able to interrupt with. So I can interrupt here and attack that way. On the other flank, I can attack with that unit last because you've already fought with the unit engaged there. And that means my second choice is going to be my Death Shroud in the middle going into those Terminators. So when the opponent does fight across multiple areas of the board, that interrupt can be pivotal in changing not how just that engagement plays out, but how all 3 or however many there are play out for the rest of the game. So besides that, there are, of course, some other important stratagems to remember, but I think it's a bit beyond the scope of this video. Hopefully that information was useful to you if you come up against Emperor's Children. I'd be interested to hear how your games have gone against Emperor's Children. I think I'm on about 50%. I think I might be just over. I played a good few games against Emperor's Children in Nephilim. Again, another reason why I think they're the strongest, because it's the most represented CSM Legion that I've come up against. And again, they are the ones that I fear coming up against the most because they really ask some questions of you. It's a very mental game, accounting for that fight first and fight last. So I'd be delighted to hear what your experiences are. And again, if you feel that I'm wrong here and that they're actually an easy fight for the Death Guard, please do share that opinion. I would be delighted to carry on the conversation in the comments. For those of you that do get involved in the comments, really does mean a lot to me. So thank you so much for that. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time in the Underhive.